You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 21st of May, 2024, on Monocle Radio.
Could and should Ukraine's allies be playing a bigger part in Ukraine's defence? Has France launched a liberation movement by accident? And what right do we have not to be impersonated by AI? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Vincent McAviney and Alex von Tunzelmann will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll talk to the author Dorian Lynskey about his new book chronicling humankind's predictions of the apocalypse, all of them inaccurate as we go to air. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller. I'm joined today by the journalist and regular Monocle Radio voice, Vincent McAviney, and by the historian, author and screenwriter, Alex von Tunzelmann. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Alex, you have recently been in Antigua.
I have, I'm afraid, purely for fun. I've been swanning around in the Caribbean.
Really, what manner of swanning around does one do in Antigua? I have not been.
It was incredibly hot. It was 31 degrees most of the time we were there. And I went and swam with sea turtles and also went and swam with stingrays.
I mean, how do you make that decision? Sea turtles one day, stingrays the next. Is there a significant difference? Aren't you still basically swimming next to somewhat bewildered and or indifferent marine creatures?
Yes, they weren't completely indifferent, the stingrays at least, because they were being fed. So that sort of cheers them up tremendously, I think, is basically. And they come and attack you like big sort of soft cartwheels looking for squid.
As long as that's the only way they come and attack you.
Yeah, no, they're not really aggressive. Mostly just,
They sort of give these big hugs. I've done it before in Cayman Islands. They sort of cover your chest.
Right.
And sort of,
it's quite jolly.
I think hugging stingrays may have gone out of fashion where I come from for Steve Irwin-related reasons.
All right.
Yes, he was very
indeed. Vincent, you have not been to Antigua, but you have been very much to the Antigua of Kent.
The Antigua of Kent, indeed. I think this is their new marketing strapline that you've come up with. Yeah, I've been in Whitstable, which, if you don't know it, it's about 45 minutes on a train out of London. It is a beautiful seaside town in Kent, right on the mouth of the sort of Thames River where it goes into the Channel. And it is sort of the seafood capital of the UK. If you like your oysters, if you like your fresh catch, it is where you go. It is all very nice fish restaurants and it's also like Britain's most independent high street, so lots of lovely shops. They sort of try and stop any chains from coming in, so it is a nice little jaunt if you happen to be in London.
See, Alex, I bet you're feeling pretty silly for flying all the way to Antigua now. You just could have gone to Whitstable.
And eaten the seafood rather than swimming with it.
Indeed. Well, we will start with Ukraine, the president of which, Volodymyr Zelensky, has suggested that Ukraine's allies could be doing more to protect it. Specifically, Zelensky wants Ukraine's neighbours to intercept incoming Russian missiles using surface-to-air systems or aircraft launched from their own territory, at least as long as Ukraine is still awaiting delivery of long-promised F-16s from various of its allies. Zelensky also wants said allies to overcome their squeamishness about Ukraine using the weapons it has been given to strike targets inside Russia. Alex, first of all, this idea of missiles being launched, one presumes, from Poland, Romania, other countries in the vicinity, as well as aircraft taking off from them to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine. Is there an argument against?
Well, yes. Yes, I mean, effectively, always the worry. I mean, in effect, this is a theme we've had since the beginning of the conflict. Zelensky has always wanted air power. He's always wanted to be able to, what he thinks would be decisive force. The fear, of course, especially, as you say, if this starts involving airfields and resources in other countries, is that this widens the conflict and potentially makes them targets of Putin's wrath too. And that could sort of significantly increase the spread of this war.
Well, indeed so, because if they became targets of Putin's wrath, there is your Article 5 moment, at which point it is, gentlemen, start your engines. But nevertheless, Vincent, there is a distinction here, I think this is at least what Zelensky is pitching, that shooting down a Russian aircraft with crew in it. That would be an obviously escalatory measure, but shooting down missiles, shooting down drones, they're not really going to incinerate half of Europe over that, are they?
Yeah, there is a distinction there. And let's never forget as well that Russia did in fact shoot down a Singapore Airlines passenger plane over Ukraine filled with people. So if we're going to talk
Malaysia
about...
Airlines.
Singapore
Airlines in the news today for other reasons.
Yes, a Malaysia Airlines plane. So Russia has form on that when it comes to Ukraine. But no, it is different. I think if you're President Volodymyr Zelensky and a month ago you were watching as Britain and France and the UK and the US took down dozens upon dozens of missiles and drones launched from Iran coming into Israel to the point where effectively only one managed to land and injure anyone, you would be wondering, well, hold on, why hasn't this been in operation here for the last 2 years? I suppose the problem is, what Iran did was heavily signposted. It was very clear they were all going to be unmanned aircraft or missiles. With Russia, there is more scope for error in terms of potentially hitting a plane as well. But, Vladimir Putin will use anything to claim that his country is under attack from the West and not only sort of clamp down at home on sort of dissident voices, but also then say that this is what they're actually on now and try and draw perhaps other satellites of Russia into a more general fight against the West. And he does, let's not forget as well, just consider Ukraine to be Russian territory. So there is always that risk as well that he fully sees it as you crossing a line into direct conflict with Russia.
Alex, as you were reminding us, there has been this dynamic now for the last 2 years of Ukraine asks for a particular thing, Ukraine's allies go, oh my God, no, we couldn't possibly do that. And then weeks or months later, they end up doing exactly that to no real response from Russia. One of Ukraine's allies who has been notably frustrated by this is Lithuania's foreign minister, recent foreign desk guest, Gabrielius Landsbergis, who's been saying today that, as he put it, we must abandon these rules that we created. Is he wrong? His suggestion has always been that Russia is essentially a paper tiger.
Yeah, well, I mean, he'd be on the front line of finding out if that turned to be not the case, wouldn't he? I mean, so, I understand, I think, the Baltic states and so on are obviously very nervous about this. And there is, of course, the frustration. I mean, as you say, it's been over 2 years. I mean, this has now, Russia is still fighting, Ukraine is still fighting. The situation has kind of, I wouldn't say it's reached exactly a stalemate, but it has not concluded. And it's actually not very clear how this is going to conclude. And I think, one can absolutely understand the frustration of Zelensky and of Baltic leaders and so on about where this is going, and the fears of the Baltic leaders that this might spread as well, and a desire for perhaps some sort of decisive victory. But I do think it's quite difficult to do that. I can see also the things, as Vincent says, the fears holding NATO countries back from a kind of escalation of that are very, very obvious. And of course, you're absolutely right. The Russians shot down the Malaysian airliner. But, Vladimir Putin is not then going to say, oh, yeah, fair enough, lads, you got me. OK, 1 for 1. If he feels there's an escalation, he will use that.
Vincent, Landsbergis also suggesting that Western military trainers should return to Ukraine to speed up the training of Ukrainian forces. He suggested that Lithuania would be happy to send soldiers if a bigger country, he suggested France, also did. It is worth reminding listeners that this is a thing that had been going on for some years. I reported myself on a Canadian-led mission in Western Ukraine, training Ukrainian soldiers 9 or 10 years ago. There's a potential advantage there, as Landsbergis sees it, that this speeds up. You don't then have to take Ukrainian troops out of Ukraine in order to train them.
Which is what the British in particular have been doing.
Indeed, yeah. So you can do it all in country. But again, you can see what the risk is, that deliberately or accidentally, or deliberately but portrayed as accidentally, a Russian missile lands on a building full of Western trainers.
I don't think it would speed things up too much to have them shifted to Ukraine. There has been a steady flow of Ukrainians who do get enlisted or who sign up, who then leave the country and go. The route in is pretty stable. Even Joe Biden took that train route into Poland. It's very well trodden now. So I'm not sure that would massively increase things. For Baltic states, they are getting nervous. I think that they would be better spending their efforts just making sure that everyone else stayed on side. The longer this war goes on and the better supported Ukraine is, effectively the safer they are, because it's depleting Russian, and we've bought in, the narrative trajectory is a little bit like Ukraine stalemate. Putin wins another term, he kills off Navalny, he's broken in on this new front. And yeah, there might be a bit of a sort of theme at the moment that Russia's on the up. But ultimately, they should have won this war, they thought, over 2 years ago now. They've suffered huge losses in personnel, huge losses in equipment, and every day it goes on, they get weaker in the face of NATO. So it would be better to spend the effort on the diplomacy and just trying to, maybe you move, you can say move the trainers perhaps to Poland and maybe have like a faster turnaround. But I think you're only talking about a matter of a day or two travel wise. I don't think it's really, it's not like you're traveling far and there's time differences they have to overcome and, new climates. They're sort of training in relatively the same conditions in the same effective time zone.
Well, to New Caledonia now, much like the air forces of Australia and New Zealand, who have been scrambled to evacuate the citizens of both countries. The French Pacific Territory has endured several days of violent unrest. At least 6 people have been killed, including 2 gendarmes, and dozens of buildings and vehicles have been burned. The issue is reforms to voting rights in New Caledonia. France's National Assembly in Paris wants these extended to all French citizens who have been resident in the Pacific archipelago for 10 years. This has displeased New Caledonia's indigenous people, known as Kanaks, who comprise about 40% of the population and who now fear a dilution of their influence. Alex, first of all, we do have to remind ourselves and our listeners that not everybody who is angry about something is necessarily right about that thing. If we proceed from the facts as they currently are, that New Caledonia is part of France and New Caledonians, including the Kanaks, are French citizens, is there any reason why any French citizen who lives there shouldn't have the vote?
Well, that's the rather tricky question, isn't it? And it's complicated here by the history of colonisation. I mean, of course, on the face of it, you would say that, as you said, about 40%, I think 41.7% or something are Kanak. That's not a majority, I mean, straightforwardly. And, a lot of the other residents have also been there for a very long time. 10 years being offered as a kind of minimum qualification to vote is quite a long time compared to quite a lot of territories, actually. So that is one thing. But of course, what this is complicated by is a history of French colonialism and the Kanaks feeling like they are indigenous to this region and the French are still there as colonisers. And I think this is kind of an interesting thing. And I mean, you can see why sort of the minute you say it's part of France, of course, I slightly hear the history of Algeria sort of floating through my head. That these kind of colonial relationships, I mean, especially having just been in the Caribbean in a former British colony of Antigua and thinking about how France and Britain have managed these colonial relationships and the sort of move into the present day quite differently, actually. But, the difference, I think, with somewhere like Antigua is that there's nothing like such a high population of Brits there than there is of effectively kind of French descent people, shall we say.
I mean, I think one of the fears of the Kanaks, Vincent, is that they tend to favour independence for New Caledonia and the idea of New Caledonia being its own country. However, there's been 3 referendums on this within the last decade. They've all been lost. The last one was a special case because pro-independence people tended to boycott it because they thought it shouldn't have been held because of COVID-19. But I think there's a fear that this move of extending the voting right to incomers is a further bulwark against any future moves to independence.
Yeah, but I mean, 3 referendums in the past decade that have consistently come back as a we don't want to go independent is definitely something. We all know France has a motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and égalité means that people shouldn't be disenfranchised, that you should have the vote. Now, when it comes to, I think 10 years is quite a long time to have to wait.
I mean, it's about 10 years longer than I had to wait to vote in the United Kingdom, for example.
Exactly. You could do other things. And just to draw on the point of how Britain and France, which I think are sort of the 2 most comparable on this when it comes to this, I grew up in something called a crown dependency, and those are a set of islands in the middle of the English Channel that are ostensibly connected to the UK, but they have their own parliament, they make their own laws, they sort of farm out defence and things like that, but they kind of, the way that UK does it is that they operate. They don't have MPs in London. It's the same with the Isle of Man. It's the same with the Caribbean. We have this Commonwealth system. France tries to do this thing where they're all in different departments and they have their own representatives in the French Parliament. They have MEPs, La Réunion, others, examples. And part of the problem is, in some ways, yes, that does keep you tighter to France, but then also means that you have less control and less individual sort of feelings that you are, that you kind of feel that there is, a historical bond, and it might not be the happiest, but there is a bond there, and there is perhaps some benefit to staying aligned with this nation state when you are a small, very remote island in particular that could be invaded by, China tomorrow if China's so determined. But you have to feel that you can also set the course of things because, Britain has a lot of nations that are, in the Commonwealth and things like that they have laws that they're not happy about, laws against LGBTQ people, which, Britain did export. And there are issues when it comes to financial affairs and offshore tax havens and those kind of things. But the people in the islands, I think there's less of a move in many of them, although there have been recent examples, potentially Jamaica in the future, but Barbados recently, of going independent because the feeling is that we get to determine our own course and we get this extra relationship that helps us on the world stage as well.
I mean, does Macron have a good move here, though, Alex? Because he has, I think, to his credit, attempted to address, while president, various aspects of France's colonial legacy. He has tried to make amends to various communities associated with Algeria. He has trodden more carefully than a lot of his predecessors around their relationships with their former colonies in West Africa. He did visit New Caledonia as recently as last year, and that's not exactly, on his way anywhere. You've really got to want to go to New Caledonia. But how do you handle something like this? Because, as you were suggesting, it is hard to look good doing this.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think this is really quite a tricky situation. And ultimately, I think, it's pretty hard to handle anything except on the wishes of the people who live there. That is kind of the principle of democracy, ultimately. And if those people don't want independence by a majority, then I sort of don't see what you can really do about that. The fact there's a historical injustice there is absolutely true, but I'm not sure that sort of, effectively sidelining democracy to fix that really does fix that in a long-term way. I'm not sure how sustainable that is. I
mean, you could have, rather than it just being purely, 10 years resident, if they're worried about kind of influx and things like that. I mean, for instance, it tends to be more on smaller island nations where spaces are sometimes at a premium. Not so much, New Caledonia, it's quite big, but, in Jersey, you have to wait 10 years before you can buy a property. It's because they need to control not having too many people move because there's not enough resources. Now, voting isn't tied to that, but it generally, I mean, if you can only rent for 10 years, you're not just going to rock up there and kind of, influx, thousands of people aren't going to rock up and influx the island. But and it shows that you're invested, New Zealand, you have to be resident to buy property and things like that. So
you have to be a citizen.
You have to be a citizen, yeah. So it does show that, you're not just sort of there on a whim and you happen to be there whilst an election's going on and you cast your vote and you're depriving these, indigenous people. You are making a real move into being part of the island and the community.
We will move on. I will just say that there is a whole other hilarious subtext to this, which is that France is accusing Azerbaijan, of all countries, of fomenting insurrection in New Caledonia. There will be more on that in tomorrow's Foreign Desk Explainer, which will be live sometime around tomorrow afternoon. You are right now listening to the Monocle Daily on Monocle Radio. I'll be back with Vincent McAviney and Alex von Tunzelmann in just a moment. Turning now to the What Fresh Hell Is This File, we find yet another portent of the immeasurable tedium and irritation shortly to be unleashed by AI. OpenAI, creator of ChatGPT, which is probably right now doing the homework of a doctor who will one day treat you, has withdrawn one ChatGPT voice after fielding the objections of the actor Scarlett Johansson, who complained that it sounded overmuch like her. OpenAI denied everything, but have nevertheless announced that they are pausing the simulacra in question. By way of demonstrating the point, this isn't actually me you're listening to, but some ghastly AI thing through which we ran the script I wrote. And I'm back, or am I?
I did think it sounded a bit wonky.
It does sound a bit wonky, and I'd like to think I don't sound entirely like that. I hope listeners are once again lulled by my stentorian, if not downright godlike baritone. But the point there is, for anybody, and this applies to everybody at this table, Vincent, for whom there is an amount of them talking in public on the internet, it can be scraped, it can be turned into that, and the thing is, we are at a relatively early stage of this. This is just going to get better and better and better. So, first question, let's do the big one first. Are we all doomed?
Well, I think there are genuine concerns, and you raise a really important point there. A bank that I use is currently really insistent on moving all of its customers over to voice identification security clearance. And every 6 months, I get into I get into a little argument with them, and I have to escalate up the chain saying, I will not move to this because there is too much of my voice online. It is very easy to find. And, 6 months ago, I did the same thing where I did your... I was slightly blown away. All I needed was 2 minutes of your voice. And I think when it will get interesting is when, in both these instances, we've just given your voice to the system, it's done an approximation. I think when you can maybe give the eye some notes, like be more a Seabrick, be more, that kind of thing, it will sort of get what you're wanting to do and make the voice better. So I think there's huge dangers with this technology. Once again, technology leaping well ahead of people and so regulators around the world. And I have a friend who works in fraud for a very big global bank. Fraud absolutely skyrocketed during the pandemic when people were at home. They're very worried about this technology. You're already getting banks that are losing sort of hundreds of millions, if not now billions of pounds of customers' money every year to very clever fraud schemes. And I think that this technology is going to play a major part in it.
Oh, absolutely. Scarlett Johansson, objected for all the obvious reasons. But again, not suggesting there's much of a connection between Scarlett Johansson being annoyed about her voice and the Kanaks of New Caledonia being annoyed about the dilution of their vote. But the same principle has to apply. Not everybody who is upset is necessarily right. And if we're taking a slightly contrary view, though I do understand her irritation and her concern, and my own view, to be clear, is that I think we should just reach around the back of AI and pull the plug out. But can we really be expected to be able to copyright a tone of voice? Aren't there lots of people who sound a bit like other people?
I mean, to an extent, yes, but obviously this was. I mean, it was not hard to work out what they were trying to do because Sam Altman, head of ChatGPT or OpenAI, announced that he wanted it to sound like the movie Her, in which Scarlett Johansson starred as an AI.
He didn't think that all the way through.
No,
did he?
I mean, so realistically, she's got a pretty good claim. And I mean, this is a woman who sued Disney and won, for God's sake. I mean, why you'd take her on?
Amazingly, a huge win on Disney.
Amount of money. Yeah, and Disney
when it came to the Black Widow distribution deal.
Yeah, I mean, that is an absolutely enormous thing. And I mean, of course, this is part of what the WGA and the actors of America were striking against last year was exactly this, was a realization that these, that actually, surely in this profession, your voice is actually part of your professional asset and that it can be used. And so, I mean, I think, I get frustrated actually when people sort of say, oh, well, you can't stop progress, you can't stop technology. Well, actually, repeatedly, the law has stopped that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to look at a case like Napster, that's exactly what happened, is that copyright law got in the way of it. I actually think, you do need to pause and take a look at that. And we've,
Well, you need a fundamental right to control of your own image and likeness, essentially,
and your
is
identity.
what we're now saying. Because the reason that it hasn't existed is because the technology wasn't there before, and now it does. And we very clearly need these rights in force. It's like, before the printing press came along, there wasn't copyright law on text, but then they thought, oh, actually, we do need to put this in place so that people have ownership of it. And particularly when we already know that there's been such malfeasance with technology as it is on social media, with sort of, catfishing and all that kind of stuff, that if we can get ahead of it this time, let's try and do that.
I mean, there is a precedent. I think it could be a useful precedent. As far back as the 1980s, Alex, the great Tom Waits sued Frito-Lay over a Doritos jingle, which he contended the voice in which sounded unmistakably like him, that people who heard this, and Tom Waits does have an extremely distinctive voice, but his contention was that people who heard this would assume it was Tom Waits. He won $2.5 million in 1980s money.
Yeah, that's real money back then. Well, I mean, this is the thing, and there's, I think, two layers to this, because as far as I can see, you've got OpenAI trying to do this, but actually, overwhelmingly, I think the great application for voice AI is fraud. I mean, I think Vincent's exactly right the way he identified that. I can't actually see a legitimate use of this outside fraud. I mean, that's basically what it is, right? Overwhelmingly. And
well, it'll be used in propaganda as well. I mean, it's not unimaginable that something like this could start, if not an outright war, then certainly serious civil disturbance or panic or...
Yeah, absolutely, as well as kind of major defamation and libel and so on. And if you can't kind of, control the use of your voice, then what is to stop your voice being used in something completely contrary to your beliefs? I mean, so I think there's real difficulties about this. As Vincent says, regulation has been left in the dust by this technology. And actually, I think there's a pretty good argument for, as you said, kicking out the plug.
And weirdly, it's one of those instances where I actually think Scarlett Johansson, the law as it is might actually fully work. So the law of passing off in this country, which is, it does work with voices where you're trying to misrepresent an individual or a business, that someone's goods and services are being offered to try and pass them off as their own. And if it's proven that there's damage. So if you have a famous voice, essentially, if you're Stephen Fry, to give an example of someone who does a lot of voiceover work, his voice is instantly recognizable. Probably Scarlett Johansson, very recognizable as well. It's very clear they're aiming to be like her. We know that by the tweet, and it would deprive her of income from having done the voice if this had gone out. So I think if she does, if it had been launched, she would have absolutely probably slam dunked a claim in a British court and on stopping this. But once again, it's just, it needs to be updated because you're trying to bend very old laws into this new technology. And as you said, I can't think of a practical, apart from a little joke with a friend, but which though could turn nasty and bad. I can't think of a real use for allowing this to be open source technology.
Well, sticking with the theme of people standing athwart human progress shouting stop, to Japan, certain denizens of which have joined that growing global body of opinion to the effect that the noise, disruption, litter and crowding caused by tourists is insufficient compensation for such fridge magnets as they may buy. Local authorities in Fujikawa, I knew that was going to happen. Fujikawa, where is AI when you need it? Fujikawaguchiko, famed for the views it offers of Mount Fuji, have blocked the vantage point with a big fence. The vexed burghers explain that they have tried asking nicely, issuing warnings and most other measures short of a fire hose, which must have been tempting, but nothing has dissuaded the busloads of Instagram bores. Alex, are we in favour of this? Are you in favour of putting up big fences in front of popular attractions in order to deter tourists?
I mean, not really, to be honest. But also, I do feel quite sympathetic to the residents of the rather unpronounceable town Fujikawa Gujiko. I don't know. Anyway, sorry. I apologise to all the residents of Japan.
All our many, actually, they're not lilistening anymore. We can say what we like about them.
Quite reasonably all turned off. The Fuji adjacent town in Yamanashi Prefecture. I do feel for them. I mean, it does sound like it's been pretty ghastly with people trooping through, dropping rubbish, clogging the place up, all of this sort of stuff, behaving quite badly. I mean,
it's like this with the sculpture of the bus outside Leytonstone Tube Station.
There are a few good examples where I actually think this should be applied in the UK as well. There's, Stonehenge, if you've ever driven down it's the A303, which is one of the main roads that goes to the southwest in this country, but it's quite a small road. Passes right by Stonehenge and people just completely slow down. There have been so many accidents and you think, actually, yeah, maybe
why,
we should.
Why are they slowing down to look at Stonehenge? What do they think it's going to do?
It's only worth driving past. Don't bother going up to it. It's so underwhelming.
I mean, it's just some big rocks. Let's be honest.
Exactly.
It's smaller than you'd reckon, isn't it?
Yeah,
But
also, but as you say, Instagram is sort of trashing things. We've had the example of Sycamore Gap here in the UK, which was the sort of famous tree planted between two hills. It was in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and it became in recent years really the area was getting trashed by a lot of Instagrammers turning up to it, and then someone cut down the tree, so everyone's kind of lost out now because it all became a bit too much for that area.
See, the reason I'm vaguely in favour of this, Alex, is that I do hope that this and similar measures, it's not the only place in the world which has started to worry that it's become too popular for its own good. I kind of hope, this may be a forlorn hope, that tourists start to recognise that it is a big world. There are lots of places you can look at other than the obvious ones, and also absolutely nobody wants to see anybody else's pictures of Mount Fuji.
No, and they're all exactly the same. Although I have to admit, some years ago I used to do some fairly regular travel writing, and one of the photographers that I went on with these pieces with, he was very funny, and he said the first thing I do is just buy a book of postcards, because you know what, I don't just replicate those shots because all the good ones have already been taken. So I won't tell you who it was, but I did think, gosh, that's nifty. I mean, there's kind of a reason people like certain things, which is that they're good, and actually it's quite hard to find completely different ones in a lot of places over and over again. So
there's the sculpture of the bus outside Leytonstone Tube Station.
Obviously that's a classic, but I mean, setting that momentarily aside, I'm sort of sympathetic to both sides here, shall I say, but I do pity the residents, but I think also they're depriving themselves of view now, which is a little bit sad for them.
It is. Just finally, I'll ask you each in turn. You first, Vincent. Is there anything you would fence off in this fashion to deter tedious rubberneckers?
On top of Stonehenge, to deter tedious
other than Stonehenge?
I mean, I worked in Westminster for sort of day in, day out for about a decade. And I mean, if we could it did happen. This did happen because Big Ben for about 5 to 6 years was under, basically scaffold for that entire time. And it is very hard to get around Westminster when you're sort of rushing around with camera kit and trying to chase a politician. There's just tourists everywhere because it's not a pedestrianised area. And there was a little part of me that did enjoy people coming out of the tube being like, where's the clock? And it just not being there for a couple of years.
So you would be in favour of fencing off the Big Ben Tower just to spite people?
Yes.
Okay, good.
And some days keeping it locked so the politicians have to all stay there.
I actually might take an even more radical view on that, which is that I think the Houses of Parliament should have been abandoned rather than being rebuilt for the absolutely enormous, obscene sum they're being rebuilt for. I think turn them into like a museum or whatever and let tourists run riot and move Parliament somewhere more sensible and purpose-built.
You are evading the question, Alex, like a politician. What would you fence off?
What would I fence off? Well, I mean, I have to admit to a certain extent to sometimes being up Primrose Hill and thinking there's so many people here. Is there any way numbers could be reduced? But I think if you fenced off the view from the top of Primrose Hill, you would cause some riots.
It is the paradox of tourism, though. It's like all these other people are ghastly. I'm fine. Alex von Tunzelmann and Vincent McAviney, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, people have been predicting the end of the world for pretty much all of recorded history. Someone is bound to be right eventually. Dorian Lynskey's immensely entertaining and curiously life-affirming latest book, Everything Must Go, The Stories We Tell About the End of the World, is a compendium of all the ways we have, touch wood, so far been wrong in film, music, literature, and pretty much every other form of expression in which one can articulate forebodings of apocalypse. I spoke to Dorian at Midori House earlier. I began by asking what impelled him to devote himself to this subject, and if he is perhaps of that generation raised on atomic paranoia.
The first sort of political insight or thought I remember having was probably reading the sleeve of the 12-inch of Two Tribes by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which is a lot of fun facts and figures about nuclear war. But weirdly, I'm not one of those people who's apocalyptically minded. I don't sort of dwell on the end of the world. I don't know whether that sort of makes me optimistic per se, but it just seems like that there's lots to worry about this side of the end of the world. The end of the world is a very dramatic, final, extreme scenario. So I don't particularly worry about that. What I have always been interested in was the intersection between sort of fact and fiction, and how ideas that are broad in politics and journalism, and more so in this book, science, make their way into fiction, and then the fictional stories make their way back out into the real world. And my first book was about protest songs, and the second book was about George Orwell's 1984. And this just seemed like another opportunity, maybe like a bigger opportunity, to just look at that relationship between different kinds of storytelling. It's called Everything Must Go, the stories we tell about the end of the world. And the reason I chose that subtitle was because it's the stories in novels and films, but it's also the narratives that politicians and activists and journalists use, that we're all sort of telling stories. And a lot of the time people will use the spectre of the apocalypse to make a point, saying we should get rid of nuclear weapons, or we should act on climate change, or we should do more to deflect asteroids, or we should watch out for unfriendly AI. Things like that. And a lot of the time they're taking storytelling tricks from fiction.
Is there something about it we actually enjoy, though, contemplating the demise of all we can see, hear, smell and touch? Because it has, as your book demonstrates, been more or less a constant of human thought. Almost from the moment we perceive that there was a world, we start worrying about the idea that it is not a permanent world.
Well, the big shift, which is sort of where the book proper starts, is in 1816 with this poem by Lord Byron called Darkness, which is the first story, I suppose. There is a narrative poem about the end of the world without God. And that's such a major philosophical break, because before then, when people talk about the end of the world, particularly in Christian culture and other religions that took that idea from Christianity, we really are talking about things that will get worse, but then they'll get really, really good. That is the promise of the apocalypse. You know, you get blood and fire.
There's still that yearning there in things like Revelation, which you quote from extensively, that there's some part of the religious mindset that wants to bring this showdown upon us.
But that's because of what the promise is next, because the promise is you separate the good from the bad on Judgment Day.
Obviously.
You've had the Battle of Armageddon, and then the later battle with Satan that people tend to forget about, because it's quite chronologically complicated, the book of Revelation. But the idea is that, yes, there'll be blood and fire and tremendous suffering, but the good people, and of course every reader counts themselves as one of the good people,
obviously,
will be rewarded with paradise. And so the really shocking break that you get with Byron and then Mary Shelley's novel The Last Man a few years later is the idea of the end really being the end. And that is something completely different, because then there is nothing to look forward to. There is only a world to look back on. Why we now get such a kick out of it is sort of quite hard to unpack, because there's lots of complicated emotions going on there. And some people say it's a memento mori. It's really good to sort of think about what you've got. You don't know what you've got till it's gone.
Or is there also a thing that we as individuals kind of resent the idea that this will all continue once we're gone? That we sort of hope to be here to see us, well, to paraphrase Tom Lehrer, us all go together when we go.
That's sort of one fantasy that it sort of weirdly takes a sting out of your own death if you think that everybody else dies at the same time. The world doesn't just keep going on without you. So there's these sort of ideas about having to confront your own death, confront the end of things. And then there's a weird destructive impulse, which I liken to a child building like a Lego tower and then knocking it down. It takes ages to build.
That was always the best bit.
Right.
Though.
And you knock it down in a minute. Like, why do you want to do that? You spent ages building it. And so Roland Emmerich movies being a really good example of just how exciting it is watching things blow up. And there's always been this obsession in the Romantic era. It was an obsession with St. Paul's in ruins, because that was the tallest building in London. And in Planet of the Apes, it's the Statue of Liberty in ruins. And then it's blowing up the White House. So there is a weird kind of idea of you want to see all the grandest elements of the world destroyed. Now, why that is quite complicated, because for some people it's just a bit of fun. I think a lot of people go and see disaster movies and they're not thinking about it too deeply. It's just sort of, imagine if this all fell apart. But then there is a very consistent strand going back to the 19th century of people who kind of loathe the world as it is, and have a genuinely more apocalyptic sense, almost that there will be a cleansing. So it's not that everybody dies. It is in that more religious sense that, like, maybe we could build a better world from the ashes of the old one, which is politically, I think, really troubling. You know, one of the ideas behind fascism is sort of everything is degenerating, and what you need to do is destroy in order to build, you know, the perfect society. And that gets wrapped up also with the politics of survivalists.
Does the story or the nature of the story we tell about the end of the world change after 1945, though? Because that's the point at which it dawns on us that the end of the world might not be through something like a pandemic or a meteorite or something we can't really control, or even Armageddon and Christ's kingdom revealed. We could actually do this to ourselves.
Yeah, and you see that in the writing almost within days. You know, there is a sudden sense that we could end the world. There's quite a lot of books about the end of the world in the 1930s, and they're all really about these other factors, comets and asteroids and the dying of the sun and all of that. It's never our fault, because even after the First World War, people didn't think generally that war could destroy humanity. And then suddenly you have this weapon, which is how Truman says, you know, unleashes the basic power of the universe. And it freaks the hell out of people. And this is sort of underrated. This is where the movie Oppenheimer, I think, is very smart, because people think that it should be more about what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where for a lot of the people involved in building the bomb, they were thinking of the future. They were thinking, well, how much worse could this get? What happens when everybody else gets the bomb? You know, they were thinking quite seriously about the end of the world. And we've kind of had that ever since, even though the threat of nuclear war subsided for a long time. It's back a bit now, but it's not like it was in the 1950s or the 80s, the real peaks of horror, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that idea that it's our fault also plays into worries about the climate crisis or AI. You know, if AI were to become an existential threat, it was because we had built it and we had programmed it wrong. And so there's something quite comforting about the idea, by comparison, morally comforting, about the idea of the comet or the asteroid. It's like, it's not our fault. We could do something to deflect it. And in fact, you know, NASA has a program named after an Arthur C. Clarke novel, which is a good example of fiction informing fact. But we wouldn't blame ourselves, which is why the movie Don't Look Up is really it's really quite interesting and sort of paradoxical in some ways, because it's about climate crisis, which would be our fault, and yet it uses a comet which wouldn't be. But then it kind of spawns all this kind of satire about how sort of greed and complacency and stupidity sort of make it our fault. Mostly when we think about the end of the world, we are blaming ourselves.
That was Dorian Lynskey, and his tremendous new book is entitled Everything Must Go, The Stories We Tell About the End of the World in a Good Bookstore Near You Now. That is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our guests today, Alex von Tunzelmann and Vincent McAviney. The show was produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Tamsin Howard, with editing assistance from Jack Dewars. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.